The American manufacturing industry is one of great innovation, great triumph, but also one of great adversity. America's manufacturing industry is what jump-started the American economy to transform itself into an industrialized nation in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution. It has also catalyzed America's rise to become the largest economy in the world following World War II. The manufacturing industry is a huge and vital part of America's economy, accounting for 11% of total GDP and employing 8% of the workforce. In 2019 alone, America's manufacturers produced over $2 trillion worth of goods. In 2020, the manufacturing sector employed more than 12 million individuals. Clearly, the American manufacturing sector is central to the economy. However, in previous decades, it has been declining. Just how did America become one of the largest world manufacturers? And just what led to the manufacturing industry's decline in recent decades? In this video, we will be exploring the manufacturing industry in the United States, tracing it from its beginning to the present day in order to examine the rise and decline of the American manufacturing industry. Throughout most of the 1700s, America was a farming-based economy, as most people lived and worked on the farms. Samuel Slater developed the first cotton mill in Massachusetts in 1790. Soon enough, cotton mills and other factories began to emerge rapidly throughout the Northeast. The factories were powered by coal, water, and steam, and workers could now produce products en masse at record speeds. The manufacturing sector fueled the development of America into an industrialized nation. America continued to industrialize throughout the 1800s, well into the 20th century. In 1913, Henry Ford implemented the assembly line into his factories, which significantly enhanced the efficiency of his factories. The assembly line significantly cut down the time it took to build a Ford Model T car, as it broke down the assembly process into 45 distinct mechanized steps. A Ford Model T car could now be assembled in just 90 minutes. Ford's vehicles were being produced in record-breaking quantities. This significantly lowered the cost of purchasing the vehicle, and soon enough, much of society was able to afford to purchase a car. Seeing the successes of Ford's endeavors, the assembly line was soon implemented in factories everywhere. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese launched a surprise air assault on America's naval base located at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The next day, the US government officially declared war with Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The US was now officially embroiled in the Second World War. The United States would need equipment, planes, tanks, guns, and ammunition to successfully take on the Germans and Japanese. In January 1942, Franklin D. Roosevelt established the War Production Board. The purpose of this act was to convert the existing factories into factories used to produce materials needed to fight the war. It also served to oversee rationing of goods such as plastic, rubber, and gasoline. American factories could no longer produce goods for the civilian population, rather now produce goods for the war effort. To get a scale of how drastic this transformation was, there were 3 million cars manufactured in 1941 by American car makers. During the entire course of the war, only 139 cars were produced. Car manufacturers like Ford no longer produced vehicles, rather they now made guns, tanks, and aircraft engines. The United States economy transitioned into an all-out war economy. The United States did not just provide war equipment to its own troops, rather supplied the allied nations throughout the world. Everyone chipped in. Those who were not serving on the battlefield, such as women, were serving in the factories. Although the men won the war on the battlefield, their victory would not have been possible without the women running the factories and producing the goods needed to fight. By the end of the war, half of the world's wartime supplies were produced in the United States. The United States, aside from the bombing of Pearl Harbor, did not suffer any damage to the homeland during the war. Its factories and cities were left unscathed. Its economy, having been in a depression prior to the war, was now a massive industrial powerhouse. The US was now the largest economy in the world. Following the war, the 1950s marked an era of stability in the US economy. Soldiers returned home, bought houses, and started families. Jobs were plentiful and wages were high. The manufacturing industry was booming. New technologies emerged, such as refrigerators, air conditioning units, microwaves, and televisions, which people started to purchase en masse. Over 5 million refrigerators were produced and sold in 1950 alone. By 1955, the US only made up 6% of the world's population, however, was making half of the world's goods. Manufacturing soared throughout the 60s and 70s. From 1961 to 1969, over 4 million manufacturing jobs were added. From 1975 through 1979, over 3 million manufacturing jobs were added, peaking in June of 1979, employing a total of nearly 20 million people. The manufacturing industry was pinnacle to the American economy. It gave birth to the American middle class. An individual with a high school education could get a job at a factory, make a decent living, start a family, buy a home, and retire comfortably. The United States was the world's largest manufacturer during this time. Many considered the period immediately following World War II the strongest point of the American economy of all time, and this was largely due to America's strong manufacturing industry, providing stable employment and decent wages for millions. However, starting in the 1980s, American manufacturing began to decline. Starting in 1980, U.S. manufacturing faced a new threat. Japan had been rapidly developing over previous decades and produced everything from cars to electronics. Japan posed significant competition to the United States manufacturing sector, as many American manufacturing companies simply could not compete. On top of this, the United States was in the midst of an inflation crisis. Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, increased interest rates to combat inflation. This resulted in appreciation of the US dollar, making American products more expensive to export to other countries. Both of these factors combined to hurt America's manufacturing sector. From 1980 to 1985, the manufacturing industry declined by 16%, losing over 3 million jobs. Many manufacturing companies shut down permanently during this time. On December 8, 1993, President Bill Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA, into law. NAFTA was a trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It abolished all trade restrictions and tariffs between the three nations, with the intended goal of increasing trade. Ultimately, while this agreement was supposed to help the U.S. economy, a lot of American manufacturing companies moved their operations to Mexico. Millions of American manufacturing jobs were lost as a result of NAFTA. This marked the beginning of how globalization led to the decline of American manufacturing, as companies began to move their factories overseas to take advantage of cheaper labor. Another threat to American manufacturing was growing around this time. China began to open itself up to the world and rapidly develop its economy throughout the 90s and early 2000s. In 2001, China entered into the World Trade Organization. Just like with Mexico before, American companies began to move their operations into China to take advantage of the cheaper labor. China began to become what is known as the world's factory, as companies from all over the world began to move their manufacturing operations over there to take advantage of the abundant supply of cheap labor, little business oversight, and business-friendly climate. Many American companies moved their manufacturing operations into China, displacing millions of American jobs. The United States also maintains a strong trade deficit with China. A trade deficit is when a country imports more products than it exports. In the case of China, the US imports more products than it exports to them. As of 2021, the US had a trade deficit of $350 billion with China, and this figure has been rapidly increasing over the years. Prolonged trade deficits can have many negative economic consequences, especially on manufacturing jobs. The United States simply imports products from them to fill domestic demand, instead of relying on domestic manufacturing to build these products. America's trade deficit with China has been responsible for the loss of millions of jobs. From the years 2001 through 2018, the trade deficit with China was responsible for the loss of over 2.5 million manufacturing jobs. From the years 2000 to 2010, more American manufacturing jobs were lost during this period than in all of US history. In 2010, China replaced the United States as the world's largest manufacturer. Although manufacturing employment has been declining, manufacturing productivity and output have been at record highs. Productivity is calculated by the value of goods manufactured divided by the number of workers. Output is the total amount of goods and services produced. In 2020, manufacturing output reached $2.3 billion. In fact, manufacturing productivity has doubled since 1987. But just how can manufacturing output be increasing while manufacturing employment is decreasing? The answer to this is automation. Technological innovations have increased manufacturing productivity in previous decades. Many of the routine tasks in the assembly line have been replaced by machines, allowing manufacturers to produce the same amount of items with fewer people. This trend has been occurring for many decades now, with computers and machinery doing more and more of the work that humans do. This is another factor as to why manufacturing jobs have been in decline. This trend will only continue. As technology advances, it will replace more and more jobs. In June 2019, manufacturing employment in the United States was 12.8 million people, down 35% since its all-time high in 1979. A combination of globalization, trade policy, offshoring of jobs, and the rise of automation have all contributed to the decline of manufacturing jobs in the United States. This has taken a toll on individuals, their communities, as well as the overall economy in a variety of ways. For many years, being employed in the manufacturing industry was the ticket to the middle-class life. One could find a job right out of high school and make a decent living, start a family, buy a home. It was the ticket to achieving the American dream. However, once these jobs started disappearing, it wreaked havoc on the individual communities, cities, and even entire states. Take the Rust Belt, for instance. The Rust Belt refers to areas of the US that were some of the hardest hit by the decline of manufacturing. The Rust Belt is made up of much of the Midwest and Northeast, in areas throughout Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania. These areas were once dominated by sectors such as steelmaking and automobile manufacturing. When manufacturing jobs started to decline, it devastated these areas. Some areas like New York City have been able to diversify its economy and make up for the loss of manufacturing jobs. However, other areas have not recovered. Detroit, for instance, used to be one of the most prosperous cities in the country, with American car conglomerates such as Ford, Chrysler, and Dodge all having major operations in that city. However, when manufacturing jobs started declining, this decimated the city, and it has been a shell of its former self ever since. Certain areas of the country have been more gravely impacted by the decline of manufacturing jobs than others. The areas comprising of the Rust Belt are just some examples of this. American manufacturing jobs are surely on the decline. In 2017, the Congressional Budget Office predicted that 10.5 of the 11.5 million net jobs created through the years from 2016 through 2026 would be in services. So far, this prediction has proved accurate. As with all highly industrialized economies, the economy gradually moves away from manufacturing into services. In addition, with technology becoming more advanced, the manufacturing sector is shifting. With the creation of new technologies such as 3D printing, the future of manufacturing in the United States will be more specialized and technical, requiring more specialized knowledge and a higher level of education. The traditional manufacturing jobs are disappearing and unlikely to return in any significant capacity as globalization, offshoring, and automation continue to displace jobs. However, manufacturing still remains a vital sector of the economy, employing millions. What will happen to those who are currently employed by the sector? For this reason, it is why it is critical we start seriously discussing these issues in the public discourse. Within the political realm, trade policies can be revised to protect domestic industry. Laws could be introduced to punish companies who choose to move their operations overseas. Hardest hit areas of the manufacturing decline, like Detroit, should receive major infrastructure investments to help rebuild itself and attract companies. These solutions may seem far-fetched and unlikely to happen, but they would certainly be reasonable and possible to implement if they had the necessary political backing. After all, what is the alternative? The decline of manufacturing jobs is certainly not going anywhere. Cities and even entire states will continue to decline as millions more individuals continue to lose their jobs at no fault of their own. These are vast and complex issues, but deserve our attention. After all, the manufacturing sector is what catalyzed our victory in World War II, propelled us to become the world's largest economy thereafter, and provided employment and stability for millions of people for decades. The manufacturing sector is what helped make this country great and deserves to be protected at all costs.